non-violent mass movements guided by liberation theology and cultural resistance. In other cases, from the LA riots to the French and more recent UK riots, violence is the expression of anger and resistance. What means of action do social movements have at their disposal, and why do they choose certain tactics at certain times? To get to the root of these differing perspectives, tonight we will separate the black bloc tactic into its constituent elements and discuss them one by one. We'll address the roles of illegality, anonymity, and violence in social movements, and conclude by asking what our differing conceptions of these indicate about our visions of transformation. Okay, so now I'd like to open for opening statements, first by Brian.
As I showed a second ago, I'm not familiar with these kind of spaces. This is not the kind of environment that I'm usually organizing in. From our publishing group, I'm here basically to represent our ideas in this venue that we don't usually work in because we think it's really important to be able to put a public face on a perspective that is usually invisibilized, is usually swept under the rug. And I want to clarify also, I'm not here tonight to try to persuade you all to utilize the black bloc tactic. If at the end of the night everyone pulls up the hoods of their sweatshirts, pulls on masks, and goes out in the street together, that might not even be a good idea. What I am here for is to talk about what is contemporary about this tactic and why it has spread. What can we learn from it in social movements generally? Similarly, I'm not here to argue for violence. I'm here to argue for a more nuanced analysis of the use of force than the violence-nonviolence dichotomy, which all of us are familiar with, and which some of us believe plays into the hands of the state in framing the narratives of social struggles. As Sarah spoke about, Occupy is not in the streets right now. It's possible to argue that it reached an impasse, and at these impasses, it's especially important that we take a step back, make use of the lull to strategize, to brainstorm, to figure out what the way forward is. And in this impasse, it's not only can we learn from why it is that black bloc tactics have taken off since Germany in the 1980s. Also, it's interesting to look at why the black bloc has been a bugaboo, why it has been useful to demonize this particular tactic. First of all, to frame it as a static group, a social body that can be alienated from the rest of the movement, that can be demonized, rather than being a tactic that anyone could potentially participate in. And perhaps the black bloc is also singled out as a bugaboo to scare us away from tactics that perhaps we need to be able to advance the social movements that we want to participate in. As I said, I'm not familiar with being on stages like this. I'm not an expert. I'm like y'all. I'm just one more participant in the struggle to get more leverage over our lives that we are all engaged in. I will speak from my own experience, and I will try to just speak from my heart. So thank you very much for coming and being here.
I certainly support diversity of tactics, and I would argue that the black bloc is an impediment to the capacity to have diverse tactics, because when you build a nonviolent protest and black bloc appears and turns that protest into one which violates those nonviolent principles, you make diversity of tactics impossible. My problem with black bloc is precisely that, that they have used the Occupy movement essentially to carry out activities that have diminished that movement. I have a hard time understanding what their goals are and how they think these tactics are going to achieve those goals. I covered revolutions, insurrections, most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, 5 years in El Salvador, the two Palestinian uprisings. I was in Sarajevo during the war. I'm not a pacifist. I understand that there are moments in human history when armed forces seek to destroy you, as they did in Bosnia, to sit in a basement in Sarajevo when we were being hit with 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day, and begin a discussion about pacifism would have evoked gales of laughter. There are moments when violence, and I find having been around violence as a war correspondent for 20 years always tragic. Violence, there are groups that set out to annihilate you and make any other response impossible. And one can look at the genocide of Native Americans as a good example of that. All of the attempts on the part of Native American communities to build any kind of a relationship with the white European settlers failed, not in small part because the Europeans violated every single one of the 400 treaties that they established. So I think that the goal of the movement, and we see it in Chicago, is to bring the kinds of numbers into the street, to make it a mainstream movement, and I think that was the power of Occupy, that it was mainstream. I would also like to say that Occupy itself was a tactic, and I don't buy this argument that Occupy is dead. Occupy is not dead. Look at the streets of Chicago. It may not be called Occupy, but if you've been following that strike, the most important strike in recent memory, in probably a few decades, when those teachers go into the police stations, when they're out on the street to use the bathrooms, the police will applaud. And that terrifies the corporate state, because in every revolution that I covered, when the pillars or the foot soldiers of control can no longer be counted upon to defend a corrupt, fragile, ruling elite, then that elite is in danger. And I think throughout human history we have seen, even in the Russian Revolution, that what tips the balance is the capacity to bring the mainstream out in the street, usually through nonviolence. The Russian Revolution was largely a nonviolent revolution. It was when the Petrograd riots took place. They sent the Cossacks in to quell the riots. They began to fraternize with the rioters, and the Tsar abdicated within a week.
Thank you to you both. Is my microphone working? It's okay? I've turned it on. Yeah. Okay, thank you both for those opening statements. I just want to, before we begin, remind everybody how the format will work. It's going to be a fairly tight, moderated debate with the person who is asked the question will have 4 minutes to answer, the other person will have 4 minutes to answer, and then the first person will have another 2 minutes to respond. I'd also like to remind people, out of respect for the speakers and respect for their points of view, if you could please refrain from shouting out or making comments while people are talking. Okay, so the first question will be to Brian. Do illegal tactics have a place in social movements in the United States? Who do they alienate or exclude, and who do they empower?
Well, the town that I come from, a small southern town that likes to think of itself as liberal, had an occupation as all the way through January, and we had an encampment. And when it finally came down, only then did we find out for sure that what we had been doing was illegal. We intercepted a memo from the town manager asking to begin enforcing the laws again. Not only had the encampment and the protests that we'd organized been illegal, but in fact, assemblies of more than a dozen people had been illegal. So everything we'd done had been illegal. In effect, we had participated in a criminal conspiracy to violate the ordinances of our little town. Now, I think many of the participants who at the end felt entitled to participate in the actions that they had throughout those months, if they'd known that they were embarking on this criminal conspiracy, would have been intimidated, would have maybe decided not to. This is one of the results of conflating legitimacy with legality. At the end, at the end of the event, they were proud that it had happened. They were proud to have participated.